Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. On the night of June 17, 2019, the small rural landscape surrounding Dakkedi village in the Indian state of Jharkhand was quiet in the way many villages become after sunset. The narrow dirt roads were mostly empty, the fields stretched out into darkness, and the sounds of daily life had begun fading as families settled into their homes for the night. In villages like this, everyone usually knew everyone else, and unfamiliar activity rarely went unnoticed. That night, however, something unusual was about to happen, an event that would eventually draw national attention and ignite a fierce debate about justice, mob violence, and the responsibilities of law enforcement across India. At the center of the story was a young man named Tabrez Ansari. He was 24 years old and had recently returned to Jharkhand after spending time working in the western city of Pune. Like many young men from rural areas, Tabrez had traveled far from home in search of employment. Construction work and other labor opportunities had taken him to different parts of the country, and he had spent several years building a modest life through hard work. Just weeks before the events of June 2019, Tabrez had married a young woman named Shahista. Their wedding had been simple but joyful, surrounded by relatives and neighbors who hoped the couple would begin a stable new chapter together. For Tabrez, the return to Jharkhand was meant to be temporary, a chance to spend time with his new wife and family before eventually returning to work. No one could have imagined how quickly that hope would disappear. Late on the night of June 17, according to later reports and witness accounts, several villagers in Dakkedi began hearing noise coming from an area near a group of houses. Some residents claimed they had seen suspicious movement around a property and believed a theft might be taking place. In many rural communities, rumors of theft can spread quickly, especially when people feel responsible for protecting their neighbors' homes and belongings. Within a short time, a group of villagers began searching the area. Eventually, they found Tabrez. Accounts of exactly what happened during those first moments vary, but what is clear is that the situation escalated rapidly. Some villagers believed he had been involved in an attempted theft. Others simply reacted to the growing crowd and the accusations being shouted around them. Before long, the gathering turned into a mob. Tabrez was surrounded by dozens of people who began questioning him aggressively. What started as shouting quickly turned violent. Witnesses later said that several individuals in the crowd began beating him, while others watched or recorded the scene on their mobile phones. The violence continued for hours. During that time, videos were recorded showing Tabrez being forced to sit on the ground while members of the crowd shouted accusations and demands. Some individuals in the group forced him to repeat religious slogans while others continued assaulting him. Those videos would later spread widely across social media, becoming some of the most disturbing visual evidence connected to the case. Eventually, the police were called. Officers arrived and took Tabrez into custody, removing him from the crowd that had gathered around him. At that moment, the violence from the mob had stopped, but the situation was far from resolved. Instead of immediately transporting him to a hospital, however, authorities brought him to a local police station. There, he remained in custody. Over the next several hours, Tabrez's condition reportedly worsened. According to later reports, he had sustained serious injuries during the assault. Despite this, he remained in police custody rather than being admitted for extended medical treatment. News of what had happened that night did not spread widely at first. In many rural areas, incidents involving local disputes or accusations of theft sometimes remain confined to the immediate community. But this case would not remain hidden for long. Within days, videos recorded during the assault began appearing on social media platforms. The footage showed the young man surrounded by a crowd, visibly injured and exhausted, while people shouted at him and recorded the scene on their phones. As the videos circulated, outrage began growing across the country. Meanwhile, Tabrez remained in custody, where his health continued to deteriorate. On June 22, 5 days after the assault, Tabrez Ansari died. His death transformed what had initially been treated as a local incident into a national tragedy. News organizations across India began reporting on the case, and the videos that had circulated online were now being examined by journalists, activists, and law enforcement officials. Questions quickly emerged about what had happened during the hours he spent in police custody, and whether more could have been done to save his life. Protests began appearing in several cities as citizens demanded a thorough investigation into both the mob attack and the handling of the case afterward. For the family of Tabrez Ansari, the shock was overwhelming. Just weeks earlier, they had celebrated his marriage and welcomed him home after years of working away from Jharkhand. Now they were mourning the loss of a young man whose life had ended under circumstances that would soon become one of the most widely discussed criminal cases in India in 2019. As investigators began examining the evidence, including the viral videos recorded during the assault, they faced the difficult task of identifying the individuals involved in the attack and determining exactly how the events of that night had unfolded. But the investigation would soon reveal a complicated sequence of actions involving not only the mob that had attacked Tabrez, but also the authorities responsible for handling his custody afterward. In the days following the death of Tabrez Ansari, the small village of Dakkady village quickly became the center of national attention. What had begun as a local incident in a quiet rural community was now being discussed across television channels, newspapers, and social media platforms throughout India. The viral videos showing the young man surrounded by a crowd and subjected to violence had shocked millions of people. As outrage spread, investigators in Jharkhand began formally examining what had happened on the night of June 17, 2019. Authorities from local police units launched an investigation into the individuals involved in the assault, while government officials announced that the case would be handled with urgency. The first step was identifying the people seen in the videos that had circulated online. Those recordings, captured by several individuals in the crowd that night, had unintentionally created a powerful piece of evidence. The footage clearly showed faces, voices, and actions that investigators could now analyze. Police began interviewing residents of the village and nearby communities. In rural areas like Dakkady, many people recognized one another, making it easier for investigators to identify individuals who appeared in the recordings. Gradually, authorities began making arrests. Several men from the village were taken into custody on suspicion of participating in the mob attack. Investigators reviewed the videos frame by frame, matching individuals seen in the footage with statements provided by witnesses. As the arrests continued, the case began moving through the early stages of the legal process. But at the same time, another troubling aspect of the incident was drawing increasing attention: the role of the police after Tabrez had been taken into custody. Reports revealed that after the assault by the mob, Tabrez had been brought to a police station rather than immediately receiving extended medical care. Although he had been examined briefly by medical staff, questions arose about whether his injuries had been properly evaluated. Human rights groups and legal experts began raising concerns about this aspect of the case. Critics argued that a person who had clearly suffered a severe assault should have received urgent hospital treatment and close monitoring. Instead, Tabrez remained in custody for several days before his health deteriorated to the point where he was taken to a hospital. By then, it was too late. These revelations intensified the public reaction. Demonstrations began appearing in cities across the country, with protesters demanding accountability for both the mob violence and the decisions made during Tabrez's detention. In major cities like Delhi and Mumbai, Activists and citizens gathered in public spaces, carrying candles and signs calling for justice. Many expressed fear about the increasing number of mob attacks reported in different parts of India in recent years. The case quickly became part of a broader national conversation about mob violence, religious tensions, and the responsibility of authorities to protect individuals from such attacks. Meanwhile, the legal investigation continued in Jharkhand. Authorities eventually arrested more than a dozen individuals in connection with the assault. Prosecutors filed charges related to murder, unlawful assembly, and other criminal offenses against those believed to have participated directly in the beating. Each suspect's role was examined based on video evidence, witness statements, and other information collected during the investigation. For Tabriz's family, the legal process was deeply painful but necessary. They had lost a son and husband whose life had been cut short under brutal circumstances. Now they watched as investigators tried to determine who should be held responsible. His wife, who had married him only weeks before the incident, spoke publicly about her grief and her desire for justice. Her words resonated with many people across the country who had followed the case from the beginning. As the investigation progressed, another issue emerged that complicated the legal proceedings. The initial medical reports regarding Tabriz's death became the subject of intense scrutiny. Early findings suggested that the cause of death might be linked to cardiac arrest, while other experts argued that the injuries he sustained during the assault could not be ignored. This disagreement sparked further debate among medical professionals and legal authorities. Eventually, additional examinations were conducted in an effort to clarify the cause of death and ensure that the investigation moved forward based on accurate information. While these technical details were being examined, the broader social impact of the case continued growing. Public discussions about mob violence and the role of social media in spreading rumors became more common. Many experts argued that false accusations and quickly forming crowds could lead to situations where individuals were attacked without evidence or due process. The videos recorded during Tabriz's assault had shown exactly how quickly such situations could escalate. What began as a suspicion voiced by a few people in a village had turned into a violent mob within minutes. For investigators and prosecutors, the challenge was now to ensure that those responsible faced the legal consequences of their actions. The arrests made during the investigation were only the beginning of a process that would eventually move into the courts. The coming months would bring legal hearings, evidence presentations, and arguments over how the case should be handled under Indian law. But beyond the courtroom proceedings, the story of Tabriz Ansari had already left a lasting mark on the national conscience. It had forced millions of people to confront difficult questions about violence, accountability, and the role of communities when rumors or accusations arise. As the investigation into the death of Tabriz Ansari continued through the months following the incident, the legal process in Jharkhand gradually began moving forward. Prosecutors had already arrested multiple individuals believed to have participated in the mob attack in Dakati village, and now the case was entering a more complicated phase, determining exactly how the charges should be applied in court. The videos that had circulated across social media had played a major role in identifying the suspects. In many criminal cases, witnesses alone may not be able to provide enough information about a large crowd. But in this situation, the recordings captured by people present that night had documented significant portions of the assault. Investigators had studied those videos repeatedly, pausing on frames that showed individuals striking Tabriz or shouting accusations. Each image became part of the evidence file used by police to build the case. Eventually, more than a dozen individuals were formally charged in connection with the attack. However, the legal process quickly became more complicated when questions emerged about the exact cause of Tabriz's death. Early medical examinations had produced differing interpretations. Some reports suggested that cardiac arrest had been the immediate cause of death, while others emphasized that the injuries from the assault could not be separated from the physical condition that ultimately led to his death. These technical medical questions had important consequences for the case. Under Indian law, charges of murder require prosecutors to demonstrate that the accused intentionally caused the death of the victim. If the evidence instead suggests that death occurred as a result of injuries that were not specifically intended to kill, different charges may apply. Because of this distinction, legal teams representing the accused began arguing that the charges should be reduced. In court proceedings, defense lawyers claimed that the available evidence did not prove that the accused had intended to cause death. They argued that while the assault had clearly occurred, the medical reports did not establish direct intent to kill. Prosecutors, on the other hand, maintained that the prolonged and severe violence inflicted on Tabrez could not be dismissed as a lesser offense. They argued that the attackers had continued beating him for hours, ignoring the obvious physical harm they were causing. The debate over these charges became one of the most closely watched aspects of the case. At one point during the legal proceedings, a local court removed the murder charges against several of the accused, replacing them with lesser charges related to rioting and culpable homicide not amounting to murder. The decision triggered immediate reaction across the country. Many activists and legal observers expressed concern that reducing the charges might weaken the pursuit of justice. Demonstrations again appeared in several cities, where protesters demanded that the most serious charges be reinstated. Government officials in Jharkhand responded by announcing that they would challenge the decision and seek stronger charges against those involved in the attack. As the legal arguments continued, the case remained a constant presence in public discussion. News programs debated the meaning of the evidence, while legal experts offered different interpretations of the medical findings and the relevant laws. For Tabrez's family, the complex legal debate was difficult to watch. Their loss had been immediate and personal, but the path to justice was proving long and complicated. Each hearing and each legal motion felt like another reminder of the tragedy that had taken their son from them. His wife continued speaking publicly about her desire to see those responsible held accountable. She described the brief time they had spent together after their marriage and the plans they had hoped to build for the future. Those words resonated deeply with many people who followed the case. Beyond the courtroom, the broader issue of mob violence remained a major topic of discussion across India. In the years leading up to 2019, several incidents had been reported in which crowds attacked individuals based on accusations of theft, rumors spread through messaging apps, or other suspicions that had never been properly investigated. The case of Tabrez Ansari became one of the most widely recognized examples of how quickly such situations could escalate. Experts studying mob behavior pointed out that when groups form quickly around accusations or rumors, individuals may feel less personally responsible for their actions. The presence of many people in a crowd can create an environment where violence spreads rapidly. In this case, the videos had shown dozens of people standing around while the assault took place. Some participated directly, while others watched or recorded the scene. For many observers, the footage raised troubling questions about how communities respond when accusations arise. Why did the crowd continue the violence for hours instead of stopping it? Why did so many people choose to record the attack rather than intervene? These questions had no easy answers, but they became part of the national reflection that followed the tragedy. As the legal process moved forward into later hearings, prosecutors continued gathering evidence and preparing for the possibility of a full trial. The outcome would depend on how judges ultimately interpreted the evidence, the medical reports, and the actions of each individual involved. Meanwhile, the story of Tabrez Ansari had already become one of the most widely discussed criminal cases in India during 2019. It had exposed the dangerous consequences of mob violence, raised difficult questions about the responsibilities of law enforcement, and forced the nation to examine how quickly rumors and suspicion can lead to irreversible tragedy. By the time the legal proceedings surrounding the death of Tabrez Ansari continued into the following months, the case had already become one of the most widely discussed incidents of mob violence in modern India. What began on a quiet night in Dakati village had expanded into a national conversation that touched on law enforcement practices, social responsibility, and the frightening speed with which rumors and accusations can escalate into violence. The court hearings in Jharkhand continued as prosecutors and defense lawyers debated the appropriate charges for the individuals accused of participating in the attack. The arguments often returned to the same central question that had complicated the investigation from the beginning: how directly the mob assault had contributed to the death of Tabrez. Medical reports remained a critical piece of the case. Different interpretations of the injuries he had suffered created ongoing debate between legal teams. Prosecutors insisted that the sustained beating he endured had clearly played a role in his death, while defense lawyers argued that the medical findings did not conclusively prove intent to kill. As these arguments unfolded in court, the accused individuals remained in custody or under judicial supervision, while the legal system slowly worked through the complex details of the case. Meanwhile, the emotional impact of the tragedy continued to shape the lives of those closest to Tabrez. For his family, the loss remained deeply personal. His father and relatives described the young man as someone who had spent years working away from home to support those around him. Like many migrant laborers from rural India, he had traveled to distant cities seeking employment, returning home only occasionally to visit his family. His recent marriage had been meant to mark the beginning of a more stable life. The celebrations that had filled their home just weeks earlier had quickly turned into mourning. His wife, who had married him shortly before the incident, suddenly found herself facing a future she had never imagined. The short time they had spent together had been filled with ordinary hopes, building a household, supporting one another, and planning for the years ahead. Instead, she became one of the most visible voices calling for justice in the case. Her interviews with journalists and her presence at legal proceedings reminded the public that beyond the debates about charges and legal definitions was a human life that had been violently taken. As the story remained in the public eye, activists and civil rights groups continued highlighting the broader issue of mob violence across the country. They argued that the death of Tabrez Ansari was not an isolated incident, but part of a troubling pattern in which accusations or rumors could quickly lead to attacks by crowds. Many experts pointed to the role of social media and messaging platforms in spreading information rapidly, sometimes without verification. In some past cases, rumors about theft, kidnapping, or other crimes had circulated widely before any authorities had confirmed whether they were true. When communities responded to those rumors with immediate suspicion, confrontations could quickly spiral out of control. In the case of Tabrez Ansari, the accusation that he had attempted theft had triggered the gathering of villagers that night. But what followed was far beyond any reasonable response to such suspicion. The videos recorded during the assault had become some of the most disturbing evidence of how easily a crowd can lose control when anger, fear, or misinformation spreads among its members. Many people who watched those recordings asked themselves the same difficult question: how had so many individuals allowed the violence to continue for hours without stopping it? Some observers believe that once a mob forms, individual responsibility becomes blurred. People in a crowd may feel protected by the presence of others, believing their own actions will not be singled out. Others may fear confronting the group and becoming targets themselves. But whatever the reasons, the result had been a tragedy that could not be undone. As months passed and the legal case moved slowly through the judicial system, the memory of Tabrez Ansari continued to influence public discussions about justice and accountability. Political leaders, legal scholars, and community organizations debated potential measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. Some called for stronger legal consequences for mob violence, while others emphasized the importance of community education and responsible communication. Law enforcement agencies also faced scrutiny regarding how they respond when individuals are taken into custody after experiencing violence. Many observers argued that the case demonstrated the importance of immediate medical evaluation and treatment for anyone who has suffered severe assault. In response to the widespread public reaction, government officials in Jharkhand announced that disciplinary actions and procedural reviews would be considered where necessary. These discussions were part of a larger national effort to understand how such tragedies could be prevented. But for the family of Tabriz Ansari, the focus remained on a simpler goal, ensuring that those responsible for the attack faced justice under the law. Each court hearing represented another step in a long and emotionally exhausting process. Legal cases involving multiple defendants and complex evidence often take years to resolve fully, and this case was no exception. Yet even as the legal outcome remained uncertain, the story had already left a permanent mark on public awareness. The name of Tabriz Ansari had become associated with a wider conversation about humanity, accountability, and the dangers of mob mentality. For many people across India, the case served as a painful reminder that justice requires patience, vigilance, and the willingness of communities to reject violence even when emotions run high. The tragedy that unfolded in a quiet village in June 2019 could never be reversed. A young man who had once traveled across the country seeking work and building a life for himself would never return home again. But the attention the case received ensured that his story would not disappear quietly. It forced an entire nation to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily suspicion can transform into violence, and how urgently societies must work to prevent such events from happening again. And in the years that followed, whenever discussions about mob violence arose, the memory of Tabriz Ansari remained a powerful reminder of the consequences when justice is replaced by anger, and a crowd chooses punishment instead of patience. Story 2. On the morning of July 18, 2018, the quiet college town of Brooklyn, Iowa was waking slowly under the soft light of a Midwestern summer. The town was small, only a few thousand residents, and life there followed familiar rhythms. Children rode bicycles through residential streets, neighbors waved from their front yards, and most people knew one another by name. It was the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked and where serious crime was almost unheard of. But by the time the summer of 2019 arrived, the name of this peaceful town would be known across the entire country because of the tragic story of a young woman named Molly Tibbetts. Molly was 20 years old, a bright and energetic college student attending the University of Iowa. She had grown up in Brooklyn and was known by friends and neighbors as someone full of life. She loved running, spending time with friends, and sharing small moments of everyday life through photos and messages with the people she cared about. During the summer of 2018, Molly had returned to Brooklyn to work and spend time with family while classes were out. Like many college students, she was balancing responsibilities and enjoying the slower pace of her hometown before the next academic year began. On the evening of July 18, she planned to do something she had done many times before: go for a run. Running was part of her routine. The quiet rural roads surrounding Brooklyn offered long stretches where joggers could move peacefully past cornfields and quiet homes. Many residents had seen Molly running along those roads before, her bright running shoes flashing against the pavement as she moved through the evening light. That evening, her boyfriend, Dalton Jack, was out of town for work. Molly had been staying at his home while he was away, helping take care of things and continuing her usual routine. Around 7:30 p.m., she left the house for her run. At first, nothing about the evening seemed unusual. The summer air was warm and the roads were quiet as the sun slowly lowered toward the horizon. Some residents later remembered seeing a young woman running along the roadside, moving steadily along the route many locals used for exercise. But as night began to fall, something changed. Molly never returned home. When Dalton tried contacting her later that evening and received no response, concern began to grow. Messages went unanswered. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. At first, it seemed possible that she might simply be out longer than expected or that her phone battery had died. But by the next day, the situation had become alarming. Friends and family contacted local authorities to report Molly missing. Officers from the Poweshiek County Sheriff's Office began looking into the situation immediately. In small towns like Brooklyn, a missing person report involving a well-known resident is taken very seriously. Within hours, investigators began organizing search efforts around the area where Molly had last been seen. Volunteers from across the community joined the search. People walked along rural roads, looked through fields, and checked areas near homes and buildings. Law enforcement officers used dogs and other resources to scan large areas of land surrounding the town. The search quickly expanded beyond the immediate community. As news spread, the story reached regional and national media outlets. Images of Molly Tibbetts appeared on television screens and social media feeds across the United States. Her smiling face, framed by long dark hair, became the symbol of a desperate search effort. Weeks passed without answers. Investigators followed hundreds of tips from the public. Each lead had to be carefully examined. Some tips suggested sightings in nearby towns. Others claimed she had been seen traveling somewhere else entirely, but none of those reports led to definitive answers. Meanwhile, search teams continued combing the rural landscape around Brooklyn. The farmland that surrounded the town stretched for miles in every direction. Cornfields, barns, gravel roads, and wooded areas created a vast environment where someone could disappear without immediate trace. The uncertainty was devastating for Molly's family. Her father, Rob Tibbetts, appeared in interviews pleading for information. Her mother and other relatives waited anxiously for news while the investigation continued. The longer the search lasted, the more difficult the situation became. Investigators from multiple agencies joined the effort, including state and federal authorities. The case had grown too large for a single local department to handle alone. Weeks turned into a month. Still, Molly remained missing. Behind the scenes, investigators were examining one crucial piece of evidence: security camera footage from homes and businesses in the area. Detectives collected recordings from any camera that might have captured activity along Molly's running route that evening. Most of the footage showed nothing unusual: cars passing along quiet roads, occasional pedestrians, ordinary life continuing as it always had. But then investigators noticed something that caught their attention. A dark-colored vehicle appeared repeatedly in several video clips taken along the same stretch of road where Molly had been running. The vehicle was a black Chevrolet Malibu. At first, it seemed like a minor detail. Cars often drive through rural roads during the evening. But when analysts reviewed the footage more carefully, they realized the vehicle appeared multiple times in the same area within a short period of time. It seemed to be circling. Detectives began focusing on that car. Whoever had been driving it might have been the last person to see Molly alive. Tracking down the driver became a priority for investigators. But identifying a specific vehicle in rural surveillance footage was not easy. Many of the cameras had limited resolution, and the images captured at night were not always clear enough to show license plates. Even so, investigators continued analyzing the footage frame by frame. They knew that somewhere behind the wheel of that car was someone who might hold the key to solving the mystery of Molly Tibbetts' disappearance. And eventually, after weeks of searching, questioning, and analyzing evidence, investigators would identify a suspect. What they would discover next would shock the entire nation. In the weeks following the disappearance of Molly Tibbetts, investigators working in and around Brooklyn, Iowa found themselves dealing with one of the most complex investigations the small community had ever experienced. What had started as a missing person report had grown into a nationwide search effort. Law enforcement agencies from across the region joined the investigation, including state authorities and federal agents who brought additional resources to analyze the growing body of evidence. The rural landscape surrounding the town presented unique challenges. Miles of farmland stretched in every direction, with gravel roads, scattered farmhouses, barns, and long rows of cornfields that could easily conceal someone or something from view. Volunteers continued walking through fields and drainage ditches, hoping to find any sign that might explain where Molly had gone after leaving for her evening run. At the same time, detectives were working behind the scenes, examining the digital and physical evidence collected during the early days of the investigation. One of the most important pieces of evidence remained the surveillance footage gathered from homes along the roads where Molly had last been seen. Investigators had collected recordings from doorbell cameras, security systems, and other devices that captured activity in the area that evening. After carefully reviewing hours of footage, detectives noticed the same vehicle appearing again and again along Molly's running route. The black Chevrolet Malibu had driven past several cameras multiple times during the same period when Molly had been jogging along the road. The repeated appearances suggested the driver might have been circling the area. Detectives began working to identify the vehicle and its owner. Because the footage did not clearly show the license plate, investigators relied on other methods. They compared the vehicle's appearance with records of cars registered in the area and interviewed residents who might have seen a similar car that evening. The process took time, but eventually, investigators identified a possible match. The vehicle belonged to a man named Christian Bahena Rivera. Rivera was a farm worker who lived in the area and had been employed at a nearby dairy farm. Like many agricultural workers in rural parts of the Midwest, he spent long days working in fields and barns, often keeping to himself and interacting mostly with coworkers. Detectives decided to speak with him. When investigators first approached Rivera, he reportedly denied any involvement in Molly's disappearance. During the initial conversation, he told officers that he had seen the young woman running along the road, but insisted that he had nothing to do with what happened afterward. However, investigators already knew his car had appeared repeatedly on surveillance cameras along the same route. As questioning continued, inconsistencies began appearing in his statements. According to later court records, Rivera eventually admitted that he had followed Molly in his car while she was running along the road. He claimed that he had approached her and spoken to her briefly before things escalated. In his account, an argument occurred after he attempted to interact with her. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing revelations of the investigation. Rivera told investigators that during the confrontation, he had become angry and panicked. He admitted that he had attacked Molly and placed her in the trunk of his car. For weeks, the search teams had been combing fields and roads without knowing where she had been taken. Now, investigators finally had a lead. After making this admission, Rivera directed authorities to a rural location in Poweshiek County. The area was a cornfield not far from where Molly had last been seen running. When officers searched the location he described, they discovered human remains concealed among the rows of crops. The search teams who had spent weeks hoping to find Molly alive now faced the devastating confirmation that the young woman they had been looking for had been killed. The discovery brought an overwhelming sense of grief to the community. News of the finding spread quickly through Brooklyn and across the country. For weeks, people had followed the story with hope that Molly might somehow be found safe. Now that hope was gone. Authorities formally announced that the remains had been identified as Molly Tibbetts. The suspect, Christian Bahena Rivera, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. As details of the case emerged, the nation reacted with shock and sorrow. The story of the young college student who had gone for an ordinary evening run and never returned struck a deep emotional chord with people across the United States. Her family, who had spent weeks waiting for answers, now faced the painful reality that Molly would never come home. In interviews and public statements, her father spoke about the overwhelming loss while also urging people not to allow anger to divide communities. His words resonated widely, reminding many that even in moments of tragedy, compassion and unity were still possible. Meanwhile, the legal process was only beginning. Prosecutors in Iowa prepared to bring the case to court, where Rivera would face trial for the murder of Molly Tibbetts. Investigators continued gathering evidence, reviewing the suspect's statements, and examining forensic findings that would be presented during the proceedings. The small town of Brooklyn had been forever changed by the events that began on a quiet summer evening. What had started as a missing person investigation had become one of the most widely followed criminal cases in the United States. But the most difficult phase of the story was still ahead. The courtroom battle that would follow would determine how justice would be delivered for the young woman whose life had ended in the cornfields of rural Iowa. In the months following the arrest of Christian Bahena Rivera, the quiet rural county where the crime had taken place slowly began preparing for a legal process that would bring the tragedy of Molly Tibbetts into the courtroom. What had begun as a desperate search across fields and country roads in Brooklyn, Iowa had now become a highly publicized murder case that would draw national attention as it moved toward trial. For the community in Poweshiek County, the case had already left deep emotional scars. Residents who had participated in the search for Molly still remembered walking through miles of farmland hoping to find any clue about her disappearance. Many of them had known her personally or had seen her growing up in the town. The idea that such a violent crime had taken place along their familiar roads was difficult to comprehend. As the legal process began, prosecutors started building their case against Rivera. The charge he faced, first-degree murder, was one of the most serious offenses under Iowa law. To secure a conviction, prosecutors would need to demonstrate that he had intentionally caused Molly's death. Investigators had already gathered several critical pieces of evidence that would form the foundation of the prosecution's argument. One of the most important elements was Rivera's own statement to investigators. During questioning after his arrest, he had described encountering Molly while she was jogging along the road on the evening of July 18, 2018. According to the account recorded by authorities, he admitted that he had followed her in his car and eventually confronted her. That admission alone had significantly advanced the investigation because it placed him directly at the scene during the critical time period. But prosecutors also relied on physical and digital evidence that supported the timeline of events. The surveillance footage collected from homes along the road where Molly had been running remained a key part of the case. Investigators had compiled several video clips showing Rivera's black Chevrolet Malibu driving repeatedly along the same route. Those recordings helped establish his movements during the time when Molly disappeared. In addition to the video evidence, investigators presented information about the location where Molly's remains had been discovered. The cornfield where Rivera had led authorities was located in a rural area outside the town, far from public view. For weeks, search teams had combed nearby land without knowing exactly where to look. Rivera's description of the location had ultimately led officers to the discovery of the remains. As preparations for trial continued, defense attorneys began outlining their strategy. They focused on questioning the reliability of Rivera's statements during the interrogation process. According to the defense, the circumstances of the questioning might have influenced what he said to investigators. They also raised questions about the interpretation of certain pieces of evidence. Legal experts watching the case understood that trials involving confessions can become highly complex. Courts must consider whether statements were made voluntarily and whether the suspect's rights were fully protected during questioning. Because of these legal standards, both sides prepared carefully for what would likely become an intense courtroom battle. Meanwhile, Molly's family tried to navigate life after the devastating loss they had experienced. The months between the discovery of her remains and the beginning of the trial were filled with public appearances, memorial events, and continued support from communities across the country. Her father, Rob Tibbets, often spoke publicly about his daughter's life rather than focusing solely on the tragedy of her death. He described Molly as compassionate, determined, and full of curiosity about the world. Friends from the University of Iowa also shared memories of the young woman who had once filled classrooms and campus spaces with laughter and energy. These stories helped remind people that Molly Tibbets was not just the subject of a criminal case. She had been a daughter, a student, and a friend whose life had touched many others. When the trial finally began in 2021, nearly 3 years after Molly's disappearance, the courtroom quickly became the focal point of national media attention. Prosecutors presented the evidence step by step, describing how investigators had pieced together the events of that summer evening. The surveillance footage was shown to the jury, illustrating how the black Chevrolet Malibu had appeared multiple times along Molly's running route. Witnesses described the search efforts that had taken place during the weeks after her disappearance. Investigators also testified about the interrogation, in which Rivera had described following Molly and ultimately leading authorities to the location where her remains were found. The defense team challenged several aspects of the prosecution's narrative. They argued that certain statements made during the interrogation might not accurately reflect what had happened. They also attempted to create doubt about whether the evidence fully supported the prosecution's conclusions. For the jurors, the responsibility was enormous. They were tasked with carefully examining every piece of evidence presented during the trial and determining whether the prosecution had proven the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. As the proceedings continued, the emotional weight of the case remained evident in the courtroom. Members of Molly's family attended many of the sessions, listening as investigators and attorneys described the events that had led to her death. For them, the trial represented the final stage in a long journey that had begun on a quiet July evening when Molly had simply gone out for a run. The verdict that would eventually be delivered would determine how the legal system responded to the crime that had taken her life. And for the small town of Brooklyn, the outcome would mark the closing chapter of a tragedy that had forever changed their community. By the time the trial reached its final stages, nearly 3 years had passed since the night Molly Tibbets left a home in Brooklyn, Iowa, for what was supposed to be a routine evening run. In that time, the small farming community had lived through fear, uncertainty, and grief as the investigation unfolded, and eventually led to the arrest of Christian Bahena Rivera. Inside the courtroom in Poweshiek County, both sides had spent days presenting their arguments. Prosecutors had carefully reconstructed the timeline of events from the evening of July 18, 2018, showing the jury how investigators pieced together the evidence that eventually led them to Rivera. The surveillance footage collected during the investigation was once again displayed during closing arguments. The recordings from multiple homes along the road where Molly had been jogging showed the same vehicle repeatedly driving through the area. Prosecutors argued that these images demonstrated how Rivera had been following her in his black Chevrolet Malibu that evening. In addition to the video evidence, the prosecution reminded the jury of Rivera's own statements to investigators. According to testimony presented earlier in the trial, he had described encountering Molly while she was running and eventually leading authorities to the location where her body had been found. For the prosecution, the combination of these elements created a clear narrative. Rivera had followed Molly, confronted her, and ultimately killed her before concealing her body in a rural cornfield. The defense, however, urged the jury to consider the case carefully and examine whether every part of that narrative had truly been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Defense attorneys questioned aspects of Rivera's interrogation and suggested that the circumstances surrounding his statements to investigators might have influenced what he said. They also argued that some of the evidence relied on interpretations rather than direct proof of the events that prosecutors described. For the jurors listening to these arguments, the responsibility was immense. Over the course of the trial, they had heard testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, and witnesses who had participated in the search for Molly. They had seen photographs, video recordings, and documents that described the investigation in detail. Now it was their task to weigh all of that information and determine whether the prosecution had proven the charge of first-degree murder. After the closing arguments ended, the jury was sent to deliberate. For Molly's family, the waiting was almost unbearable. They had spent years moving through the painful stages of the investigation and trial, hoping that the legal process would eventually bring a sense of justice. Outside the courthouse, members of the community gathered quietly, aware that the decision being made inside the jury room would mark the final outcome of one of the most painful chapters in the town's history. After deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with its verdict. They found Christian Bahena Rivera guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the decision was read aloud. For Molly's family, the verdict represented the conclusion of a long legal battle that had begun with the desperate search for their missing daughter. While no verdict could bring Molly back, the decision confirmed that the person responsible for her death would be held accountable under the law. During the sentencing phase that followed, the judge imposed a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. With that decision, the legal case reached its formal conclusion. For the community of Brooklyn, the verdict brought a sense of closure, though the emotional impact of the tragedy would remain for years to come. Residents who had participated in the search efforts often spoke about how deeply the case had affected them. The roads where Molly had once jogged were the same roads where neighbors had walked together searching for any clue that might lead to her. The cornfields surrounding the town, once simply part of the landscape of rural life, had become forever associated with the events of that summer. Yet even amid the grief, Molly's memory continued to inspire acts of kindness and remembrance. Scholarships and community programs were created in her name, helping students pursue education and encouraging others to live with the same sense of curiosity and determination that friends and family remembered in her. At the University of Iowa, where Molly had studied before her death, fellow students and faculty members honored her memory in different ways, ensuring that her life would be remembered not only for the tragedy that ended it, but also for the impact she had on those around her. Her father often spoke publicly about the importance of compassion and unity, even in the face of devastating loss. In interviews, he urged people not to allow anger or hatred to divide communities. Those words resonated with many people across the country who had followed the case closely. The story of Molly Tibbetts became one of the most widely known true crime cases in the United States during that time. It reminded people how quickly an ordinary moment, a young woman heading out for a jog on a summer evening, could turn into an unimaginable tragedy, but it also reminded many of the power of community. During the weeks when Molly was missing, hundreds of volunteers had joined the search. Neighbors, strangers, law enforcement officers, and investigators had worked side by side hoping to find answers. Although the outcome had been heartbreaking, those efforts reflected the determination of people who refused to give up when one of their own disappeared. Years later, the memory of Molly Tibbetts continued to live on through those who loved her, and through the lessons many hoped the case would teach about vigilance, justice, and the value of every human life. The quiet town where her story began would never forget the young woman who once ran along its peaceful roads. And while the legal case had ended, the legacy of Molly Tibbetts remained, carried forward by family, friends, and a community determined to remember her not only for the tragedy that took her life, but for the life she lived before that moment. Story 3. On a quiet residential street in Zama, just outside the sprawling metropolis of Tokyo, a small, unremarkable apartment building stood like hundreds of others in the area. It was the kind of place no one paid much attention to, where tenants came and went quietly, where life moved in routine patterns, and where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. But in October 2017, a discovery inside one of those apartments would shock not just Japan, but the entire world. The case would continue to unfold through 2018, revealing details so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. At the center of it all was a man who had used the anonymity of the internet to identify his victims, gaining their trust in their most vulnerable moments, and turning their despair into an opportunity for unimaginable violence. The story begins not with the killer, but with the victims, young individuals navigating the pressures of modern life in Japan, many of them struggling silently with loneliness, depression, and thoughts they felt they could not share with those around them. Japan, despite its technological advancement and social order, has long faced challenges related to mental health stigma and isolation. Online platforms often become a refuge for those seeking connection, understanding, or simply someone to listen. It was within this digital space that a man began watching, searching, and waiting. That man was Takahiro Shiraishi, a 27-year-old who had recently moved into the Zama apartment. On the surface, there was nothing particularly remarkable about him. He had held various jobs, including work in the adult entertainment industry, and had a history that, while unstable, had not drawn significant attention from law enforcement. But beneath that ordinary exterior was a calculated and deeply disturbing mindset. Shiraishi had discovered a method to find victims who were not just vulnerable, but actively expressing a desire to die. Using Twitter, he searched for posts containing phrases related to suicide. These were not random searches, but deliberate attempts to locate individuals at their lowest emotional point. When he found them, he reached out with carefully crafted messages, offering what appeared to be empathy, understanding, and even companionship in death. He presented himself as someone who could help them end their suffering, someone who would not judge them, someone who would be there with them in their final moments. For individuals who felt alone, unheard, and overwhelmed, his messages often felt like a lifeline. But it was not help he was offering, it was a trap. In August 2017, one of the victims, a 15-year-old girl, posted online expressing suicidal thoughts. Shiraishi contacted her, initiating a conversation that quickly turned into an agreement to meet. He suggested that they could die together, a concept known in Japan as shinju, or double suicide. It was a tragic cultural phenomenon that had appeared in various forms throughout history, often romanticized in literature and media. But in this case, it was being weaponized. The girl disappeared shortly after meeting him. Over the following weeks, more individuals vanished. They came from different backgrounds, different parts of Japan, but shared a common thread. Each had expressed vulnerability online. Each had been contacted by Shiraishi, and each had agreed to meet him. One by one, they entered his apartment, believing they were meeting someone who understood them. None of them left. Inside that apartment, the reality was far removed from the promises he had made. Investigators would later determine that Shiraishi had not participated in mutual suicide at all. Instead, he murdered his victims, exploiting their trust and their emotional fragility. The details of what happened inside that apartment were so disturbing that they would later lead to widespread media coverage and national debate about online safety, mental health awareness, and the responsibilities of digital platforms. The case might have continued even longer if not for the disappearance of 23-year-old Takahiro's final known victim, whose brother refused to accept that she had simply vanished. Determined to find her, he gained access to her social media accounts and began reviewing her messages. What he found would become the turning point in the investigation. He discovered conversations with a man whose tone was unsettling, someone who had encouraged his sister's darkest thoughts rather than trying to dissuade them. Recognizing the danger, he contacted police and provided them with the account information. This single act of persistence would set in motion the chain of events that would expose everything. Police traced the account back to Shiraishi. On October 30th, 2017, officers arrived at the apartment in Zama. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but as they entered, they were met with a smell that immediately raised alarm. What they would discover inside would soon dominate headlines across Japan and beyond. In coolers and storage containers, investigators found dismembered human remains. The scale of the crime became clear almost immediately. This was not a single victim, not an isolated incident, but a series of murders carried out with chilling method and precision. By the end of the search, authorities would confirm that multiple victims had been killed inside that small apartment. As the investigation expanded into 2018, more details emerged about the victims, about Shiraishi's methods, and about the systemic gaps that had allowed him to operate undetected. Each revelation deepened the horror of the case, but also raised critical questions about how such crimes could be prevented in the future. What made this case particularly disturbing was not just the violence, but the manipulation. Shiraishi had not forced his way into his victims' lives. He had been invited in. He had identified their pain, mirrored it back to them, and used it as a weapon. It was a form of predation that was both modern and deeply psychological, one that relied not on physical strength, but on emotional exploitation. As news of the case spread, the public reaction was immediate and intense. Japan, a country known for its low crime rates, was shaken. The idea that someone could use social media to systematically target vulnerable individuals struck at the heart of modern life. It forced people to reconsider how they interacted online, how much they shared, and who might be watching. But for the families of the victims, the headlines and debates were secondary. They were left to grapple with an unimaginable loss, trying to understand how their loved ones had been drawn into such a situation, and whether anything could have been done to prevent it. The investigation would continue into 2018, uncovering evidence that would ultimately lead to Shiraishi's trial and conviction. But even as the legal process moved forward, the deeper questions remained, about isolation, about responsibility, and about the hidden dangers that can exist behind the most ordinary facades. And as the story unfolded, one thing became painfully clear. This was not just the story of a killer. It was the story of how vulnerability can be exploited, how trust can be weaponized, and how, in a world more connected than ever before, some people can still be dangerously, fatally alone. As investigators from the Kanagawa Prefectural Police secured the apartment in Zama, what initially appeared to be a disturbing but contained crime scene quickly expanded into something far more complex and horrifying. The discovery of human remains inside storage containers was only the beginning. As forensic teams moved methodically through the small, cluttered space, each new finding deepened the scale of what had occurred within those walls. It became evident that this was not a single act of violence, but a series of calculated killings carried out over an extended period of time. The apartment itself was modest, almost cramped, consisting of a single main room, a small kitchen area, and a bathroom. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about it, nothing that would suggest it had been the site of multiple murders. But inside, investigators found coolers and toolboxes containing body parts, carefully concealed yet impossible to ignore once discovered. The remains were in various stages of decomposition, indicating that the killings had occurred over weeks, not days. By the end of the initial search, authorities would confirm the presence of multiple victims, eventually identifying 9 individuals, 8 women and 1 man. The suspect, Takahiro Shiraishi, was arrested at the scene without resistance. According to police reports, he did not attempt to deny the accusations. Instead, he spoke with a calmness that investigators found deeply unsettling. Almost immediately, he began confessing. He admitted to luring victims to his apartment through Twitter, targeting individuals who had expressed suicidal thoughts. His statements were direct, lacking visible remorse and disturbingly matter-of-fact. As the interrogation progressed, Shiraishi described a pattern. He would search for keywords related to suicide, reach out to users, and offer assistance in ending their lives. He framed himself as someone who understood their pain, someone willing to accompany them in death. But once they arrived at his apartment, the reality changed completely. Investigators later confirmed that he murdered each victim, often shortly after they entered his home. In some cases, he admitted to restraining them. In others, he described how quickly the situation escalated once they realized something was wrong. The forensic process that followed was painstaking. Each set of remains had to be carefully cataloged, analyzed, and identified. DNA testing became a crucial component, as many of the victims had been reported missing across different regions of Japan. Families who had been searching for answers were soon confronted with the worst possible outcome. One by one, the identities of the victims were confirmed, linking them back to missing persons reports that, until that point, had not been connected. The timeline began to take shape. The murders had occurred over a span of approximately 2 months, between August and October 2017. Each victim had been contacted online, each had agreed to meet, and each had disappeared shortly afterward. The consistency of the pattern left little doubt about the premeditated nature of the crimes. This was not impulsive violence. It was a deliberate system. Digital forensics played a critical role in building the case. Investigators recovered message histories from Shiraishi's accounts, documenting conversations with victims in the hours and days leading up to their meetings. The tone of these messages was chilling in its calculated empathy. He mirrored their emotions, validated their despair, and gradually introduced the idea of dying together. In some exchanges, he reassured victims that their suffering would soon end. In others, he emphasized that they would not be alone. What made these communications particularly disturbing was how effectively they bypassed suspicion. There were no overt threats, no signs of coercion. Instead, there was a gradual emotional manipulation that made the victims feel understood. For individuals already in a vulnerable state, this approach proved devastatingly effective. Investigators also uncovered evidence suggesting that Shiraishi had financial motives in some cases. Personal belongings, including cash, were found in the apartment. While the primary driver of the crimes appeared to be psychological and predatory, the presence of stolen items indicated an additional layer of exploitation. As news of the case spread across Japan, public reaction intensified. Media coverage was relentless, with major outlets in Tokyo and beyond providing continuous updates. The term "Twitter killer" quickly emerged in headlines, reflecting both the method used to contact victims and the growing concern about the role of social media in enabling such crimes. The case also triggered immediate scrutiny of online platforms. Questions were raised about whether warning signs had been missed, whether certain types of content should have been flagged earlier, and what responsibility platforms had in protecting vulnerable users. While Twitter maintained that it cooperated fully with authorities, the broader debate about digital safety had already begun. At the same time, the investigation revealed just how close the case had come to continuing. Authorities found evidence that Shiraishi had been actively communicating with additional potential victims at the time of his arrest. Had the brother of the last victim not intervened, it is likely that more individuals would have been drawn into the same pattern. Inside the interrogation room, Shiraishi's demeanor remained consistent. He answered questions, provided details, and did not attempt to construct a complex defense. Instead, his statements reinforced the calculated nature of his actions. He acknowledged targeting individuals who expressed suicidal thoughts because they were less likely to resist or report him. This admission became one of the most damning elements of the case, demonstrating clear intent and awareness. The legal process began to take shape as prosecutors prepared charges. Given the number of victims and the nature of the crimes, the case would become one of the most significant criminal trials in Japan in recent years. Each charge had to be supported by forensic evidence, digital records, and confession statements, all of which needed to withstand scrutiny in court. Meanwhile, families of the victims began to speak publicly. Their accounts added another layer of tragedy to the story. Many described their loved ones as kind, thoughtful individuals who had been struggling privately. Some families had been aware of their emotional difficulties, while others were shocked to learn about the extent of their distress. Across all accounts, there was a common thread, a sense of disbelief that someone could exploit such vulnerability so deliberately. The broader societal impact of the case continued to grow. Mental health professionals, policymakers, and advocacy groups began calling for increased awareness and support systems for individuals experiencing suicidal thoughts. The case highlighted not only the dangers posed by individuals like Shiraishi, but also the gaps in how society identifies and supports those in crisis. By early 2018, the investigation phase had largely concluded, but its effects were far from over. The evidence collected would form the foundation of a trial that would later draw national attention. Prosecutors were preparing to present a case that was as comprehensive as it was disturbing, one that would rely heavily on the digital trail left behind. As the legal proceedings moved forward, one question lingered above all others. How had something so systematic, so deliberate, gone unnoticed for as long as it did? The answer, investigators believed, lay not just in the actions of one individual, but in a convergence of factors: technology, isolation, and the quiet struggles of people who felt they had nowhere else to turn. And as Japan prepared to confront the full weight of this case in court, the details that would emerge next would only deepen the understanding of just how calculated and how preventable these crimes might have been. By the time the case moved fully into the judicial system in 2018, the name Takahiro Shiraishi had already become synonymous across Japan with a kind of calculated modern predation that few had imagined possible. What began as a missing person investigation had evolved into one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in the country's recent history. And now, the focus shifted from discovery to accountability. Prosecutors began assembling a case that would not only establish guilt, which, given the confessions and physical evidence, was already overwhelmingly clear, but would also demonstrate the full extent of intent, planning, and psychological manipulation behind each of the 9 murders. Inside the legal framework of Japan, cases of this magnitude are approached with a meticulous emphasis on evidence and confession, and in this instance, both were extensive. The prosecution's argument centered on a simple but devastating truth: these crimes were deliberate, repeated, and executed with full awareness. There was no ambiguity about what had happened inside the apartment in Zama. The question was not whether Shiraishi had committed the murders, but how the court would interpret the nature of those acts and what punishment would follow. The defense, however, attempted to introduce a different perspective, one that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the trial. They argued that several of the victims had expressed a desire to die and had, in some form, consented to the act. It was a claim that immediately drew public outrage. Families of the victims, along with legal experts and advocacy groups, strongly rejected this framing, emphasizing that vulnerability is not consent and that manipulation invalidates any notion of voluntary participation. The idea that a predator could exploit someone's darkest moment and then claim cooperation became a focal point of national debate. Prosecutors countered this argument with digital evidence recovered from Twitter conversations, demonstrating how Shiraishi had carefully guided victims toward meeting him. The messages revealed a pattern of emotional conditioning. He did not simply respond to suicidal thoughts. He nurtured them, reinforced them, and positioned himself as the only person who truly understood. In several exchanges, he offered reassurance that the process would be peaceful, that there would be no suffering, and that he would be there with them. These promises, prosecutors argued, were not only false but intentionally deceptive, designed to lower resistance and ensure compliance. Forensic evidence reinforced the prosecution's case. Autopsy reports indicated that the victims had not died in the manner they had been led to expect. Investigators testified about the physical evidence recovered from the apartment, including restraints and tools used during the crimes. The condition of the remains and the methodical way they had been concealed further demonstrated premeditation. This was not a spontaneous act carried out in response to a victim's request. It was a controlled process repeated multiple times. As the trial proceedings unfolded, the scale of the tragedy became even more apparent through victim impact statements. Families described the lives that had been lost, not as abstract numbers, but as individuals with aspirations, relationships, and futures that had been cut short. Some spoke of missed warning signs, moments they wished they had understood differently. Others expressed anger not only at Shiraishi, but at the broader circumstances that had allowed their loved ones to become so isolated that they sought solace from a stranger online. The courtroom became a space where two narratives collided. On one side was the calculated strategy of a man who had identified and exploited a vulnerability in society. On the other was the collective grief of families trying to reconcile how such a thing could happen. The emotional weight of the proceedings was undeniable, and it extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Public attention remained intense, particularly in Tokyo and surrounding regions. Media outlets covered each development closely, often highlighting the broader implications of the case. Discussions about mental health, online anonymity, and digital responsibility became part of everyday conversation. Experts were brought in to analyze not only the criminal behavior, but the social environment that had enabled it. The role of Twitter came under renewed scrutiny during this phase. While the platform had been used as a tool, the case exposed how easily it could be manipulated. The ability to search for specific phrases related to distress or self-harm allowed Shiraishi to identify targets with alarming precision. In response to growing pressure, discussions began around policy changes, including how such content should be monitored and whether intervention mechanisms could be improved. At the same time, mental health professionals emphasized a critical point. The issue was not solely technological. The deeper problem lay in the isolation experienced by many individuals, particularly young people, who felt unable to express their struggles in their immediate environments. The case became a stark reminder that digital spaces often serve as a last resort for those seeking connection, and that without proper support systems, those spaces can become dangerous. Throughout the proceedings, Shiraishi himself remained largely composed. Reports from the courtroom described him as calm, at times detached, offering responses when prompted but rarely displaying visible emotion. This demeanor only intensified public perception of the crimes as calculated rather than impulsive. There was no dramatic outburst, no clear expression of regret that might suggest internal conflict. Instead, there was a consistency that aligned with the methodical nature of the evidence presented. As prosecutors continued to lay out their case, they focused heavily on establishing intent across all 9 murders. Each count was supported by a combination of digital communication, forensic findings, and Shiraishi's own statements. The repetition of the pattern became one of the most powerful elements of the prosecution's argument. It showed not just what he had done, but how he had refined his approach over time, becoming more efficient, more controlled, and more confident with each successive victim. The defense's argument regarding consent gradually lost traction as the full context of the interactions became clear. Legal experts noted that even if a victim expresses a desire to die, it does not provide legal or moral justification for another person to facilitate or carry out that act, especially under deception. The court appeared increasingly aligned with this perspective as the trial progressed. Beyond the courtroom, the impact of the case continued to ripple through Japanese society. Schools, universities, and workplaces began to place greater emphasis on mental health awareness. Helplines reported increased activity as the case prompted more people to seek help or check on others. While the tragedy could not be undone, it had begun to shift conversations in a meaningful way. By late 2018, the legal process had reached a critical stage. The evidence had been presented, the arguments made, and the narrative of the crimes firmly established. What remained was the court's final judgment, a decision that would determine not only the fate of Shiraishi, but also how the justice system would respond to a case that had challenged conventional understanding in so many ways. And as the country waited for that decision, one truth had already become undeniable. This case was not just about one man's actions. It was about the intersection of vulnerability and opportunity, about the unseen struggles people carry, and about the devastating consequences when those struggles are met not with help, but with harm. As the legal process moved toward its conclusion, the weight of everything that had been uncovered in the apartment in Zama lingered heavily over the courtroom. The case against Takahiro Shiraishi was no longer a question of uncertainty or interpretation. It had become one of the most clearly documented and systematically executed series of murders in modern Japanese criminal history. The remaining question was not whether he would be held accountable, but how the justice system would respond to crimes that had shocked a nation and exposed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond one individual. By 2018, the investigative phase had already revealed the full scope of the case. Prosecutors had established a consistent and deliberate pattern, targeting vulnerable individuals through Twitter, gaining their trust, and ultimately luring them into a controlled environment where they were killed. The defense's earlier attempts to frame the victim's state of mind as a form of consent had been met with overwhelming rejection, both legally and socially. The court increasingly viewed the case through the lens of exploitation and premeditation, rather than any notion of mutual intent. As proceedings continued into the following years, the trial formally began in 2020 at the Tokyo District Court, where the evidence presented during the 2018 investigation would be examined in full detail. Unlike many drawn-out trials, this one moved with unusual clarity. Shiraishi, who had previously confessed to the murders, ultimately pleaded guilty. There was no prolonged dispute over the facts. Instead, the focus shifted almost entirely to the nature of the crimes and the appropriate sentence. During the hearings, prosecutors reiterated the calculated strategy behind each killing. They emphasized that Shiraishi had not acted impulsively or under emotional distress. He had identified a specific type of victim, refined his approach through repetition, and carried out each act with a level of control that demonstrated full awareness of his actions. The use of digital platforms to locate victims was presented as a key element of premeditation, highlighting how modern technology had been deliberately used to facilitate traditional forms of violence. The defense, while no longer contesting the core facts, attempted to argue for a lesser sentence by focusing on Shiraishi's background and psychological state. They suggested that his actions, while undeniably severe, were influenced by personal circumstances, and that the victim's initial willingness to engage in discussions about death should be considered as part of the broader context. However, these arguments struggled to gain traction against the overwhelming evidence of manipulation and control. For the families of the victims, the trial represented a painful but necessary step toward closure. Many attended proceedings, listening as details of the crimes were revisited in a formal setting. Their presence served as a reminder that this case was not just about legal arguments, but about real lives that had been lost. Statements from family members reflected a mixture of grief, anger, and a desire for accountability. Some expressed frustration that the crimes had been allowed to continue for as long as they had. Others focused on honoring the memory of their loved ones, emphasizing who they were beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Public attention remained intense throughout the trial, particularly in Tokyo and across Japan. The case had already sparked national conversations about mental health, online safety, and the responsibilities of digital platforms. Now, As the legal system prepared to deliver its final judgment, there was a collective sense that the outcome would carry broader significance. In December 2020, the court delivered its verdict. Takahiro Shiraishi was sentenced to death. The ruling reflected the court's conclusion that the crimes were exceptionally grave, marked by a high degree of planning, cruelty, and exploitation. The judgment rejected any argument that the victim's vulnerability diminished the severity of the acts. Instead, it emphasized that their vulnerability had been deliberately targeted, making the crimes even more serious. The sentencing brought a measure of legal closure, but it did not erase the impact of what had happened. The case continued to resonate, influencing policy discussions and public awareness in the years that followed. Social media platforms, including Twitter, faced increased pressure to monitor and respond to content related to self-harm and suicide. While changes were implemented over time, the case remained a reference point in debates about the balance between privacy, freedom of expression, and user safety. Mental health advocacy also gained renewed urgency. The story of the victims highlighted how isolation and unaddressed emotional distress can create conditions where individuals become vulnerable to exploitation. In response, there was a greater push for accessible support systems, public education, and efforts to reduce stigma around seeking help. Helplines, counseling services, and community outreach programs reported increased engagement, suggesting that the case had prompted more people to speak openly about their struggles. At the same time, the case left behind difficult questions that could not be easily answered. How could such a pattern go unnoticed in a society known for its order and safety? What responsibilities do individuals, communities, and institutions share in identifying and addressing vulnerability? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how many similar risks might exist in spaces that are still largely invisible? For many, the most haunting aspect of the case was not just the actions of one individual, but the method he used. There was no forced entry, no immediate violence that drew attention. Instead, there was a gradual process of trust building, carried out through screens and messages, hidden within the everyday flow of digital communication. It was a reminder that danger does not always appear in obvious forms, and that harm can be facilitated through systems designed to connect people. In the years since the crimes, the apartment in Zama has become a symbol of that reality. A place that once seemed ordinary is now associated with a series of events that challenged assumptions about safety, technology, and human behavior. The physical space can be changed, renovated, or even erased, but the story attached to it remains. The victims, whose lives were cut short, are remembered not for the circumstances of their deaths, but for who they were before they encountered someone who exploited their pain. They were individuals with families, ambitions, and identities that extended far beyond the messages they posted online. Their stories continue to be told as a way of ensuring that they are not reduced to a single moment in time. And in the end, this case stands as more than a record of crime and punishment. It is a reflection of a world where connection and isolation coexist, where technology can both support and endanger, and where the line between help and harm can sometimes be manipulated in ways that are difficult to detect. It is a reminder that vigilance is not just about watching for obvious threats, but about understanding the deeper conditions that allow those threats to emerge. Justice, in a legal sense, was delivered. But the broader lessons of what happened in that small apartment in Zama continue to unfold, shaping conversations about safety, responsibility, and the value of recognizing and responding to vulnerability before it is too late. Story 4. On an unseasonably warm afternoon in February 2017, the small town of Delphi felt like it was waking up early from winter. Located between Indianapolis and Lafayette, Delphi was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where routines rarely changed, and where the idea of violent crime felt distant, almost abstract. It was a town defined by quiet roads, local schools, and familiar faces. But on February 13th, 2017, that sense of safety would be permanently shattered. What began as a simple day off from school for two young girls would turn into one of the most haunting and widely followed criminal cases in modern American history. A case that would leave a community searching for answers, investigators pursuing every lead, and the public captivated by a mystery that unfolded piece by piece over the years. This is the story of two friends, their final afternoon together, and a crime that would raise difficult questions about trust, technology, and how even the smallest communities are not immune to unimaginable violence. 14-year-old Liberty German and 13-year-old Abigail Williams were by all accounts inseparable. They were at an age where friendship meant everything: shared secrets, laughter, inside jokes, and the kind of bond that forms during the transition from childhood into adolescence. Liberty, often called Libby, was known for her curiosity and confidence. She loved sports, music, and spending time outdoors. She had a strong personality, someone who wasn't afraid to speak her mind. Abigail, or Abby, was quieter but equally warm, with a gentle demeanor that complemented Libby's energy. Together, they balanced each other in a way that made their friendship feel effortless. On that Monday, both girls were enjoying a day off from school. It was the kind of unexpected break that felt like a small gift, a chance to escape routine and spend time outside. Libby's grandmother dropped them off near the Monon High Bridge Trail, a local hiking area that was popular with residents. The trail was familiar, a place where people walked, explored, and took in the natural surroundings. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt like home. At approximately 1:35 p.m., the girls were dropped off near the trailhead. They planned to spend a few hours walking, talking, and enjoying the mild weather. Like many teenagers, they documented their day through photos and videos. At around 2:07 p.m., Libby posted a photo of Abby walking along the Monon High Bridge to Snapchat. It would later become one of the most widely shared images associated with the case, a snapshot of an ordinary moment, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The Monon High Bridge itself was both scenic and unsettling. It was an abandoned railroad bridge, elevated high above the ground, with gaps between the wooden planks that required careful footing. Crossing it was an experience that combined beauty with a slight edge of fear. For teenagers, it was an adventure. For locals, it was a landmark. For investigators, it would soon become the center of a crime scene. Sometime after that photo was taken, the girls encountered a man on the trail. He was captured briefly in a video recorded by Libby on her phone, a decision that would later prove to be one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. In the short clip, the man is seen walking toward them on the bridge, his hands in his pockets, his posture steady. The video is grainy, but clear enough to establish his presence. Along with the video, there is audio, 4 words that would echo across the country in the months and years that followed. Guys down the hill. At the time, the girls likely didn't fully grasp the danger they were in. Encounters with strangers on trails were not uncommon, and nothing about the setting immediately suggested a threat. But something about the interaction was concerning enough for Libby to begin recording. Whether it was instinct, caution, or a subtle recognition that something wasn't right, that decision would become a crucial turning point in the case. When Libby and Abby failed to return to the designated pickup location later that afternoon, concern began to grow. Initially, it may have seemed like a simple delay, 2 teenagers losing track of time. But as the minutes turned into hours, that concern shifted into alarm. Family members began searching the area, calling their phones, hoping for a response that never came. By the evening, local authorities were notified, and a search operation was launched. Volunteers from the community joined in, combing through the trails and surrounding areas with flashlights as darkness fell. Delphi was the kind of town where people showed up for each other, and that night was no exception. There was still hope that the girls would be found safe, perhaps lost or injured, waiting to be discovered. But as the hours passed, that hope began to fade. The following day, February 14th, 2017, the search resumed with greater intensity. Law enforcement agencies, volunteers, and search teams expanded their efforts, covering more ground and focusing on areas near the trail. At approximately 12:15 p.m., the bodies of Libby and Abby were discovered on private property not far from the bridge. The news spread quickly, transforming a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. The shock was immediate and profound. This was not supposed to happen in Delphi. Not here. Not to two young girls who had simply gone for a walk on a familiar trail. Investigators moved swiftly to secure the scene and begin collecting evidence. The area where the bodies were found became the focal point of a complex and highly sensitive investigation. Details about the condition of the crime scene were not fully released to the public, a decision that would later become part of the broader strategy to preserve the integrity of the case. What was made clear, however, was that this was a deliberate and violent act. The video and audio recorded on Libby's phone quickly became central to the investigation. Law enforcement released portions of the footage to the public, hoping that someone would recognize the man captured on camera. The image of the suspect, wearing a jacket, jeans, and a cap, became one of the most recognizable visuals in modern true crime. The audio clip, brief but chilling, added another layer of urgency. "Guys down the hill." Those words, spoken in a calm but commanding tone, suggested control. They suggested intent, and they suggested that the man knew exactly what he was doing. As the investigation expanded, tips began pouring in from across the country. People analyzed the video, the audio, the clothing, the gait of the suspect. Every detail was scrutinized. Law enforcement worked to separate credible leads from speculation, a task made more challenging by the sheer volume of information being received. In the days that followed, the families of Libby and Abby were thrust into a reality that no one is ever prepared for. They spoke to the media, appealing for information, urging the public to come forward with anything that might help identify the man responsible. Their grief was visible, but so was their determination to seek justice. The case quickly gained national attention, becoming a focal point for discussions about safety, technology, and the role of digital evidence in modern investigations. Libby's decision to record the encounter was widely recognized as an act of courage, providing investigators with a critical piece of evidence that might otherwise not have existed. But even with that evidence, the case remained unsolved. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still, the identity of the man on the bridge remained unknown. Sketches were released, updated, and debated. Press conferences were held, each one bringing renewed attention but no definitive answers. The community of Delphi, once defined by its quiet stability, now lived under the shadow of uncertainty. Someone knew who that man was. Someone had seen him, recognized him, heard his voice. The question was whether they would come forward. And as the investigation continued, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not just a crime of opportunity. It was a calculated act carried out in a place where the perpetrator likely felt confident, familiar, and in control. In the days following the discovery of the bodies near the Monon High Bridge outside Delphi, the investigation rapidly expanded from a local search effort into a complex, multi-agency homicide case. The quiet trails that had once been a place of recreation were now sealed off, marked with police tape, and examined inch by forensic teams. What investigators found at the scene would remain largely undisclosed to the public, a deliberate decision that would later become one of the defining features of the case. Authorities believed that holding back key details would help them distinguish between credible leads and false confessions, but it also meant that much of what happened that afternoon would remain known only to the killer and those working the case. The Indiana State Police, along with local departments and federal partners, took the lead in coordinating the investigation. Very early on, they made it clear that this was not a random accident or a case of misadventure. This was a double homicide, and the individual responsible had been captured, at least in part, on video and audio recorded by Liberty German. That single piece of evidence would become both the most powerful tool in the investigation and one of its most frustrating limitations. The video clip released to the public showed a man walking across the bridge toward the girls, his figure slightly hunched, his hands in his pockets. His face was partially obscured by distance and angle, but his clothing, blue jacket, jeans, a cap, became instantly recognizable. Investigators believed that someone somewhere would recognize him not by a clear facial image, but by his posture, his gait, or even the way he carried himself. The accompanying audio, just 4 words, "Guys." Down the hill, added urgency and tension, suggesting authority and control. It implied that the encounter had shifted from casual to coercive in a matter of seconds. Within hours of releasing the footage, tips began flooding in. Hundreds quickly turned into thousands. People from across United States called in with names, suspicions, and theories. Some tips were based on genuine concern, someone recognizing a voice or a familiar mannerism. Others were driven by speculation, fueled by the intense media coverage that had already begun to surround the case. Sorting through this volume of information became a monumental task, requiring investigators to prioritize, verify, and eliminate leads with precision. At the same time, law enforcement worked to reconstruct the timeline of February 13th in as much detail as possible. They identified individuals who had been on or near the trail that afternoon, conducting interviews to determine who had seen what and when. Witness accounts provided fragments of information, sightings of a man matching the general description, reports of unusual behavior, but none were definitive enough to immediately identify a suspect. Each detail was logged, cross-referenced, and revisited as new information emerged. One of the most critical components of the investigation was digital forensics. The phone belonging to Libby contained not only the video and audio, but also data that helped establish the timeline of events. Investigators analyzed timestamps, location data, and communication records to understand the sequence of movements leading up to the encounter. This process helped confirm that the girls had been alive and active on the trail shortly before the incident, narrowing the window during which the crime had occurred. Despite these efforts, the case quickly encountered a central challenge. The suspect had left behind very little that could be publicly used to identify him. There was no clear DNA profile released, no identifiable vehicle captured on camera, and no immediate connection to known offenders in the area. The man on the bridge remained an unknown figure, both visible and elusive at the same time. In July 2017, several months after the murders, investigators released a composite sketch based on witness descriptions. The sketch depicted an older man, with a hat and a somewhat stern expression. It became widely circulated, appearing on news broadcasts, billboards, and social media platforms. For many, this image became synonymous with the case, a face to attach to the unknown voice and figure captured in the video. But even with the sketch, progress remained slow. As the investigation continued, law enforcement emphasized that the perpetrator was likely someone familiar with the area. The Monon High Bridge Trail was not an obvious location for someone unfamiliar with Delphi. It required a certain level of knowledge to navigate, to understand where people might be isolated, and to move through the terrain without drawing attention. This led investigators to believe that the suspect either lived nearby, worked in the area, or had spent enough time there to feel comfortable. Meanwhile, the families of Abigail Williams and Liberty German continued to advocate for the case, keeping it in the public eye. They participated in interviews, attended press conferences, and worked closely with law enforcement to encourage anyone with information to come forward. Their presence served as a constant reminder that this was not just an investigation. It was a search for justice for 2 young lives that had been taken far too soon. The case also began to attract attention from online communities, particularly those focused on true crime. Forums, discussion boards, and social media groups analyzed every available detail, often generating theories about the identity of the suspect. While some of this attention helped keep the case visible, it also created challenges for investigators, as misinformation and speculation sometimes interfered with legitimate leads. In February 2018, 1 year after the murders, law enforcement held a press conference to mark the anniversary. The tone was both reflective and determined. Investigators acknowledged the frustration of the case remaining unsolved, but reiterated their commitment to finding the person responsible. They emphasized that the investigation was still active, that tips were still being evaluated, and that they believed the case could be solved with the right piece of information. At that point, the case had already evolved beyond a local tragedy. It had become a national story, one that highlighted both the capabilities and limitations of modern investigative techniques. The presence of video and audio evidence created a sense that the answer should be within reach, yet the absence of a clear identification underscored how difficult it can be to translate evidence into a suspect. Behind the scenes, investigators continued to pursue multiple avenues. They reviewed past offenders, examined regional crime patterns, and collaborated with other agencies to identify potential connections. Advances in forensic science, including developments in DNA analysis, were also considered, though no major breakthroughs were publicly announced at that time. One of the most striking aspects of the case was the psychological profile that began to emerge. The suspect had demonstrated a level of confidence and control, approaching the girls in broad daylight on a public trail. He had used minimal words, suggesting a plan that relied on authority rather than prolonged interaction. Investigators believed that this behavior indicated familiarity with such actions, or at least a level of preparation that went beyond spontaneity. As 2018 progressed, the case remained unresolved, but it was far from inactive. Each new tip, each re-examined piece of evidence, kept the investigation moving forward, even if progress was not immediately visible to the public. Law enforcement maintained that the person responsible was still out there, potentially living a normal life, blending into the same kind of communities that Delphi represented. And that reality was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. The man captured in that short video clip was not just a figure on a screen. He was a real person, someone who had walked away from the scene and disappeared into everyday life. Someone who might be seen at a store, at work, or in a neighborhood unnoticed by those around him. Someone who knew exactly what he had done. As the investigation moved deeper into 2018, the case in Delphi entered a phase that was both frustrating and quietly transformative. Publicly, it appeared as though progress had slowed. There were no arrests, no definitive suspects announced, and no clear breakthroughs that could bring immediate resolution. But behind the scenes, investigators from the Indiana State Police and partner agencies were reassessing every assumption they had made in the early stages of the case. What had initially been approached as a search for a recognizable individual was evolving into something more complex, a realization that the person they were looking for might not fit the profile they had originally imagined. The first major shift came with a renewed focus on behavioral analysis. Investigators began to examine not just what the suspect had done, but how he had done it. The short clip recorded by Liberty German remained central, but now it was being analyzed in greater depth. Experts looked at the suspect's gait, his posture, the way he moved across the uneven planks of the bridge. They studied the tone of his voice in the audio recording, calm, controlled, authoritative. These details suggested a level of confidence that raised new questions. Was this someone with prior experience? Someone accustomed to giving commands? Or someone who had carefully prepared for this specific moment? At the same time, investigators revisited witness statements collected in the days immediately following the murders. Some accounts had seemed minor or inconsistent at first, but in light of new perspectives, they took on added significance. Reports of a younger-looking man, descriptions that did not fully align with the original composite sketch, and observations that had previously been set aside were brought back into consideration. This reevaluation marked a turning point in how the case was being approached. In April 2019, just over 2 years after the murders but building directly on investigative work that intensified through 2018, law enforcement held a press conference that would dramatically alter the public narrative. Standing before a room filled with media and community members, officials unveiled a new composite sketch. This second image depicted a significantly younger man than the first, clean-shaven, with a different facial structure and overall appearance. The announcement was accompanied by a clear statement. The investigation had shifted, and the individual represented in the new sketch was now considered the primary person of interest. For the public, this change was both shocking and confusing. For more than 2 years, attention had been focused on the original sketch, which suggested an older suspect. Now, investigators were asking people to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The man on the bridge, they explained, might appear older than he actually was. His clothing, his posture, even the grainy quality of the video could have contributed to a misleading impression. Along with the new sketch, authorities released an extended version of the audio recording. The phrase "guys down the hill" was expanded to include an additional word, providing a slightly clearer sense of the interaction. While still brief, the updated audio reinforced the impression of control and intent. It also served as a renewed call to the public. Someone, somewhere, might recognize that voice. During the same press conference, investigators addressed the suspect directly in a manner that was both unusual and deliberate. Speaking as if the individual might be watching, they suggested that he could be hiding in plain sight, living among the very community that had been affected by the crime. They described him as someone who might appear normal, someone who could blend into everyday life without raising suspicion. The message was clear. This was not a distant outsider, but potentially someone with ties to the area. This shift in strategy reflected a deeper understanding of the case. Rather than focusing solely on identifying a stranger, investigators were now considering the possibility that the suspect had a connection to Delphi or the surrounding region. The Monon High Bridge Trail was not an obvious location for someone unfamiliar with the area. Navigating it required a certain level of comfort, an awareness of its layout and its isolated sections. This reinforced the idea that the perpetrator might have had prior knowledge of the environment. As new information was released, the volume of tips increased once again. People who had previously dismissed their suspicions began to reconsider. The updated sketch prompted fresh discussions, both within the community and across the country. Investigators worked to process this influx of information, applying the same careful scrutiny they had used from the beginning. Meanwhile, advancements in forensic technology offered additional avenues for exploration. While specific details were not publicly disclosed, it was widely understood that law enforcement was exploring all available options, including newer methods of DNA analysis. Cases in other parts of the United States had demonstrated how genetic genealogy could be used to identify suspects years after a crime had been committed. Whether such techniques would play a role in Delphi remained uncertain, but the possibility added another layer of hope to the investigation. Throughout this period, the families of Abigail Williams and Liberty German continued to be a driving force behind the case's visibility. They attended press conferences, participated in interviews, and worked closely with law enforcement to ensure that the search for answers did not fade from public attention. Their resilience in the face of prolonged uncertainty became a defining aspect of the story, reminding everyone involved that this was not just an investigation, but a pursuit of justice for 2 young lives. The community of Delphi also adapted to the ongoing reality of the case. What had once been a place defined by routine now carried an undercurrent of caution. Residents became more aware of their surroundings, more attentive to unfamiliar faces or unusual behavior. The sense of safety that had been disrupted in 2017 had not fully returned, replaced instead by a collective determination to remain vigilant. Despite the lack of an immediate resolution, investigators maintained confidence that the case could be solved. They emphasized that even the smallest detail, a remembered conversation, a seemingly insignificant observation, could prove to be the key. The challenge was not a lack of effort, but the complexity of connecting the right piece of information to the right individual. As the investigation continued, one reality became increasingly apparent. The man captured in that brief video had managed to evade identification for years, but he had not disappeared completely. He existed somewhere within the broader network of communities, routines, and relationships that define everyday life. The task was to find the connection that would bring him into focus. And as time moved forward, that connection would eventually emerge, not through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through a combination of persistence, evolving strategy, and the willingness to revisit what had once been overlooked. As the years passed after 2018, the case that had once seemed frozen in uncertainty began, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, to move toward resolution. The investigation in Delphi had never stopped, but for the public, the absence of visible progress had created the impression that the man on the bridge might never be identified. Behind the scenes, however, investigators from the Indiana State Police and their partners continued to follow leads, re-examine evidence, and apply evolving techniques in an effort to close the gap between suspicion and proof. It was not a single breakthrough that changed the course of the case, but rather a gradual accumulation of details, small pieces of information that, when brought together, began to form a clearer picture. One of the key developments came through the re-evaluation of earlier tips. In a case that had generated thousands of leads, it was inevitable that some information would not receive immediate attention, not because it lacked value, but because it did not initially stand out among the volume of incoming data. As investigators revisited these tips with fresh perspective, certain names and details began to resurface. Patterns emerged, connections that had not been obvious in the early days of the investigation. At the same time, the evolving understanding of the suspect's profile played a crucial role. The shift from the original sketch to the younger composite image had already signaled a change in direction. Investigators were no longer confined to a narrow interpretation of the suspect's appearance or background. Instead, they broadened their approach, considering individuals who might have been overlooked under the earlier assumptions. This flexibility proved essential in narrowing down potential leads. In October 2022, more than 5 years after the murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German, law enforcement made a significant announcement. A man named Richard Allen, a resident of Delphi, had been arrested and charged with the murders. The news sent shockwaves through the community and across the country. For years, the suspect had been described as someone who could be hiding in plain sight, and now that possibility had become reality. Allen was not an outsider. He lived in the same small town where the crime had occurred. He worked a regular job, interacted with members of the community, and by most accounts led a life that did not attract significant attention. The idea that someone so close to the center of the investigation could remain unidentified for so long was both startling and deeply unsettling. According to court documents and statements released by investigators, Allen had come into contact with law enforcement early in the investigation. He had reported being on the Monon High Bridge Trail on the day of the murders, placing himself in the vicinity at a critical time. However, at that stage, his statement did not immediately elevate him to the level of a primary suspect. It was only through later review and the integration of additional evidence that his presence on the trail took on greater significance. One of the most important pieces of evidence connecting Allen to the crime was forensic in nature. Investigators identified a link between a firearm associated with Allen and a cartridge found at the crime scene. While the specifics of this evidence were subject to legal proceedings and further examination, it represented a tangible connection that had not been publicly known in earlier stages of the investigation. This development underscored the importance of preserving evidence and revisiting it as new methods and perspectives become available. The arrest marked a turning point, but it was not the end of the process. The case moved into the legal system, where prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared to present their arguments. The complexity of the investigation, combined with the time that had elapsed since the murders, meant that the legal proceedings would require careful handling of evidence, witness testimony, and procedural details. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought a mixture of emotions. There was relief in knowing that a suspect had been identified and taken into custody, but also the recognition that the journey toward justice was not yet complete. The years of waiting, of living with unanswered questions, could not be undone. What remained was the hope that the legal process would provide clarity and accountability. The community of Delphi, too, was forced to confront the reality of what the arrest represented. The idea that the suspect had lived among them for years reinforced the message that investigators had delivered early in the case, that the person responsible could be someone familiar, someone seemingly ordinary. It challenged assumptions about how such crimes occur and who might be capable of committing them. As the case progressed through the courts, it continued to draw national attention. The combination of video evidence, audio recordings, evolving investigative strategies, and the eventual identification of a suspect made it one of the most closely followed cases in recent years. It also highlighted the persistence required in complex investigations, where answers may not come quickly, but can still emerge through sustained effort. Looking back, the story of the Delphi murders is not defined solely by the crime itself, but by the path that followed. It is a story of how a small piece of evidence, a brief video recorded on a phone, can carry immense significance. It is a story of how investigations can evolve, adapt, and ultimately succeed, even after years of uncertainty. And it is a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, remains a goal that drives those who seek it. The voices of Abigail Williams and Liberty German were captured in a moment that would become central to the case, a moment that helped ensure their story would not be forgotten. That recording, simple yet powerful, became a bridge between the unknown and the eventual identification of a suspect. In the end, what began as a quiet afternoon in a small Indiana town became a case that resonated far beyond its borders. It revealed the vulnerabilities that can exist even in familiar places, but also the determination of investigators, families, and communities to seek answers, no matter how long it takes. And while the legal process continues to unfold, one truth remains clear: the search for justice in Delphi did not end with silence. It endured through years of uncertainty, through countless leads, through evolving strategies, until the path forward finally came into view. Story 5. On the morning of September 8, 2017, what began as an ordinary school day in the bustling city of Gurugram quickly turned into a nightmare that would shock the entire country. The corridors of a well-known private institution, usually filled with the sounds of children laughing, teachers guiding, and the hum of daily routine, became the setting for a crime so disturbing that it would ignite national outrage, spark debates about school safety, and leave a family shattered beyond repair. Within minutes, panic spread through the campus of Ryan International School, as whispers of something terrible began to move from classroom to classroom, teacher to teacher, until the truth emerged, one that no parent ever expects to hear when they drop their child off at school. At the center of this tragedy was a 7-year-old boy, Pradyuman Thakur, a child described by his family as bright, cheerful, and full of curiosity. Like any other morning, he had arrived at school with his father, carrying with him the innocence and routine of a normal day. There was nothing unusual about that morning, nothing to suggest that within a short span of time, his life would be taken in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable. His parents had trusted the school environment to be safe, structured, and protective. It was a trust shared by thousands of families across the country, one that would be deeply shaken by what happened next. According to the initial sequence of events, Pradyuman had gone to the school washroom shortly after arriving on campus. It was a place meant to be ordinary, unnoticed, part of the daily rhythm of school life. But on that morning, it became the site of a brutal crime. Within minutes, he was found critically injured, his condition so severe that there was little that could be done. The details that followed were difficult to comprehend, not only because of the violence involved, but because of where it had taken place. A school, a space that symbolized safety and learning. The discovery triggered immediate chaos. Teachers rushed to understand what had happened, school authorities scrambled to manage the situation, and emergency services were called. News began to spread beyond the school walls, reaching parents, local residents, and eventually media outlets. As more information emerged, the initial shock turned into anger and fear. How could something like this happen inside a school? How had such a crime gone unnoticed, even for a short period of time? Very quickly, attention turned to the people who had access to the premises that morning. Among them was a bus conductor employed by the school, Ashok Kumar. Within hours of the incident, he was taken into custody by the police. According to the early statements made by law enforcement, he had allegedly confessed to the crime, claiming that he had attempted to assault the child and, when resisted, carried out the attack. This narrative was widely reported, and for many, it seemed like a straightforward explanation, an individual act committed by someone in a position of proximity and opportunity. But even in those early hours, there were questions. The speed with which the suspect had been identified, the nature of the confession, and the broader circumstances surrounding the case began to draw scrutiny. Families of other students expressed concern about safety measures within the school, including supervision, access control, and the presence of staff in sensitive areas. Protests erupted outside the school premises, with parents demanding accountability and transparency. The incident was no longer just a criminal case. It had become a public issue, one that touched on trust, responsibility, and systemic failure. Meanwhile, the family of Pradyuman Thakur was left grappling with an unimaginable loss. Their grief was compounded by the suddenness of the event and the intensity of the media attention that followed. In a matter of hours, their personal tragedy had become a national headline. Their son, who had started the day like any other child, had become the focus of a case that would be debated, analyzed, and revisited for months to come. As the investigation continued, authorities worked to reconstruct the timeline of events within the school. CCTV footage was reviewed, staff members were questioned, and physical evidence was collected from the scene. Each detail was examined in an effort to understand not just what had happened, but how it had been allowed to happen. The answers, however, were not as straightforward as they initially appeared. The case began to take on a complexity that went beyond a single act. There were inconsistencies in statements, gaps in the timeline, and emerging doubts about the initial narrative. Questions were raised about whether the crime had been properly investigated, whether the right procedures had been followed, and whether the truth had been fully uncovered. As public pressure mounted, the investigation came under increasing scrutiny. What had first been presented as a solved case now seemed uncertain. The possibility that the initial conclusions might be incomplete or even incorrect introduced a new layer of tension. The search for justice was no longer just about identifying a perpetrator. It was about ensuring that the process itself was accurate, transparent, and free from error. And as the days passed, it became clear that this case was far from over. In the days following the death of Pradyuman Thakur, the case that had initially seemed straightforward began to unravel in ways that raised more questions than answers. What had first been presented as a quickly solved crime, with the arrest of Ashok Kumar, soon came under intense scrutiny from multiple directions: legal, forensic, and public. The narrative that had been constructed in the immediate aftermath began to show cracks, and with each passing day, those cracks widened into serious doubts about whether the truth had been fully uncovered. The investigation, initially handled by the Haryana police, had moved rapidly. Within hours of the incident, Ashok Kumar had been detained, interrogated, and presented as the primary suspect. According to police statements at the time, he had confessed to the crime, and the case appeared to be heading toward a swift conclusion. But almost as quickly as that narrative had been established, it began to face resistance, first from the family of the victim, and then from the wider public. Pradyuman's parents refused to accept the explanation as complete. They questioned how such a serious crime could be solved so quickly, and whether the investigation had been thorough enough to rule out other possibilities. Their doubts were not based on speculation alone. They were rooted in inconsistencies that began to emerge in the official version of events. Reports suggested that the confession may have been obtained under questionable circumstances, raising concerns about the methods used during interrogation. These concerns, amplified by media coverage, led to growing demands for an independent investigation. As public pressure mounted, the case began to draw national attention. Protests erupted outside the school, with parents demanding accountability not just from the accused, but from the institution itself. There were serious concerns about security lapses within Ryan International School, questions about how a non-teaching staff member could access areas where children were present without supervision, and why adequate safeguards had not been in place. The incident had shaken the confidence of parents across India, many of whom began to question the safety of schools more broadly. Amid this growing unrest, the investigation took a decisive turn. The case was handed over to the Central Bureau of Investigation, commonly known as the CBI. This transfer marked a critical moment, signaling that the initial findings were no longer considered sufficient and that a deeper, more comprehensive inquiry was necessary. For many, it also represented a renewed hope that the truth, whatever it might be, would finally come to light. When the CBI began its investigation, one of its first priorities was to re-examine the evidence from the ground up. This included forensic analysis, CCTV footage, witness statements, and the timeline of events within the school on the morning of September 8th. Unlike the earlier investigation, which had moved quickly toward a conclusion, the CBI approach was methodical and cautious. Each piece of evidence was scrutinized, not just for what it showed, but for what it might have been assumed to show. One of the most significant developments came from the reanalysis of CCTV footage. Investigators closely examined the movements of students and staff within the school premises, paying particular attention to the time window during which the crime had occurred. This detailed review revealed inconsistencies in the earlier narrative, gaps that suggested the possibility of a different sequence of events. It also led investigators to consider individuals who had not been the focus of the initial inquiry. At the same time, forensic evidence was reevaluated. The nature of the injuries, the positioning of the victim, and other physical details were analyzed to determine whether they aligned with the version of events provided in the original confession. As this process unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the case might not be as simple as it had first appeared. Perhaps the most dramatic shift came when the CBI began to question the credibility of the confession attributed to Ashok Kumar. Reports indicated that the agency found no conclusive evidence linking him directly to the crime. This raised the possibility that the initial arrest had been premature or even mistaken. For a case of this magnitude, such a realization carried profound implications, not only for the investigation itself, but for public trust in the system. As the focus shifted, investigators began to explore an alternative theory, one that would fundamentally change the direction of the case. This new line of inquiry centered on the possibility that the crime had been committed by someone within the student body. It was a hypothesis that seemed almost unthinkable at first, but as evidence was gathered and analyzed, it began to gain traction. The idea that a student could be involved introduced a new layer of complexity. It required investigators to navigate not only legal challenges, but also ethical considerations. The identity of minors is protected under Indian law, meaning that details about the individual could not be publicly disclosed. This limitation added to the sense of mystery surrounding the case, even as the investigation moved forward. In November 2017, the CBI made a major announcement that would redefine the case. They detained a student of Ryan International School, suggesting that he was responsible for the crime. According to the agency, the motive was linked to a desire to postpone exams and a parent-teacher meeting. It was a revelation that stunned the nation, not only because of the age of the accused, but because it contradicted the entire narrative that had been established in the early days of the investigation. This development raised difficult questions. How had the initial investigation failed to identify the correct suspect? What factors had led to the early conclusion that pointed toward Ashok Kumar? And perhaps most importantly, how could such an act be committed within a school environment by someone so young? The case now stood at a crossroads. On one hand, there was the initial version of events, built around a confession that was now being questioned. On the other, there was a new narrative, supported by the findings of the CBI, but still subject to legal scrutiny and public debate. The search for truth had become more complicated, not less. For the family of Pradyuman Thakur, the shifting narrative brought both hope and uncertainty. The possibility that the real perpetrator had been identified offered a sense of progress, but the contradictions between the two investigations also raised concerns about whether justice would ultimately be served. The legal process ahead would need to address these inconsistencies, ensuring that the conclusions reached were based on solid evidence and fair procedure. As 2017 drew to a close, the case remained unresolved, but it had already transformed into something much larger than a single incident. It had exposed weaknesses in investigative processes, highlighted the importance of forensic accuracy, and sparked a nationwide conversation about safety, accountability, and the protection of children. And as the investigation moved into its next phase, one thing became increasingly clear. The truth was still being uncovered, piece by piece, and the path to justice would be longer and more complex than anyone had initially expected. As the case moved beyond the initial investigation and into the legal arena, the focus shifted from discovery to proof, from suspicion to accountability. The narrative that had already undergone a dramatic transformation now faced its most critical test: whether the conclusions drawn by the Central Bureau of Investigation could withstand scrutiny in a court of law. What had begun as a tragedy inside Ryan International School was now evolving into a prolonged legal battle, one that would stretch across years and highlight the complexities of the justice system when dealing with conflicting investigations and sensitive circumstances. At the center of this phase was the juvenile accused, whose identity remained protected under Indian law. The allegation that a student could have committed such a crime had already shocked the public, but in court, shock and disbelief were not enough. The prosecution needed to establish a clear chain of evidence, one that could definitively link the accused to the murder of Pradyuman Thakur. This required not only presenting the findings of the investigation, but also addressing the inconsistencies and contradictions that had emerged from the earlier inquiry. The defense, on the other hand, challenged the conclusions of the CBI at multiple levels. Questions were raised about the interpretation of evidence, the procedures followed during the investigation, and the possibility of alternative explanations. The case was no longer just about what had happened on September 8, 2017. It was about how that event had been investigated, and whether the methods used had met the standards required for a conviction. One of the most significant aspects of the legal proceedings was the debate over the treatment of the accused as a juvenile. Under Indian law, individuals below a certain age are subject to a different legal framework, one that emphasizes reform and rehabilitation over punishment. However, in cases involving serious offenses, there is a provision for determining whether the accused should be tried as an adult. This decision is not taken lightly. It involves an assessment of the individual's mental and emotional maturity, their understanding of the consequences of their actions, and the nature of the crime itself. In this case, the Juvenile Justice Board played a crucial role in evaluating these factors. Their decision would influence not only the legal strategy of both sides, but also the broader direction of the case. The process involved psychological assessments, expert opinions, and detailed consideration of the available evidence. It was a reminder that the justice system must balance the need for accountability with the principles of fairness and due process, even in the most difficult circumstances. Meanwhile, the earlier accused, Ashok Kumar, remained a significant figure in the unfolding narrative. His initial arrest and alleged confession had been central to the first phase of the investigation, but the subsequent findings of the CBI had cast serious doubt on his involvement. Legal proceedings addressed his position as well, examining whether he had been wrongfully accused and whether his treatment during the investigation had been appropriate. His case added another layer of complexity, highlighting the potential consequences of premature conclusions in high-pressure situations. As hearings continued, the courtroom became a space where multiple versions of the truth were presented, questioned, and tested. Witness testimonies were examined in detail, forensic reports were scrutinized, and the sequence of events was reconstructed again and again. Each side sought to build a narrative that was not only plausible, but supported by evidence strong enough to meet the legal standard of proof. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to capture public attention. Media coverage remained intense, with each development analyzed and debated across news platforms and social media. For many, the case had become symbolic of larger issues: school safety, the reliability of investigations, and the functioning of the justice system. The fact that the narrative had changed so dramatically from the initial arrest to the later developments raised important questions about how cases are handled in their earliest stages, particularly when public pressure is high. The family of Pradyuman Thakur remained at the center of this prolonged journey. Their pursuit of justice required not only patience, but resilience in the face of uncertainty. Each court date, each new piece of information, brought with it a mixture of hope and anxiety. The legal process, by its nature, is methodical and often slow, but for those directly affected, the passage of time does little to ease the weight of loss. As the case progressed into the following years, it became clear that a final resolution would not come quickly. Legal procedures, appeals, and ongoing examinations of evidence meant that the matter would continue to unfold over an extended period. This was not unusual for complex cases, particularly those involving conflicting investigations and sensitive legal considerations. However, it did mean that the sense of closure remained out of reach. At a broader level, the case prompted discussions about systemic changes. Questions were raised about school safety protocols, background checks for staff, and the monitoring of access within educational institutions. There were calls for clearer guidelines and stricter enforcement to ensure that similar incidents could be prevented in the future. The tragedy had exposed vulnerabilities that extended beyond a single location, touching on issues that affected families across India. At the same time, the investigation itself became a subject of analysis. The contrast between the initial findings of the Haryana police and the later conclusions of the CBI highlighted the importance of thoroughness, objectivity, and adherence to procedure. It underscored the need for systems that can withstand pressure and maintain accuracy, even in the face of intense public scrutiny. By this stage, the case had evolved far beyond its origins. It was no longer defined solely by the events of a single morning, but by the complex journey that followed, the shifting narratives, the legal challenges, and the ongoing search for clarity. The question was no longer just what happened, But how do we ensure that the answer, when it comes, is the right one? As the case moved forward through the legal system, what had begun as a shocking incident inside Ryan International School gradually transformed into a prolonged and deeply complex judicial process, one that tested not only the strength of the evidence, but also the resilience of those seeking justice. The years following 2017 did not bring a swift resolution. Instead, they revealed just how intricate and demanding the pursuit of truth can be when a case is marked by conflicting investigations, sensitive legal considerations, and intense public scrutiny. After the Central Bureau of Investigation presented its findings, the case entered a phase where every element, every claim, every piece of evidence, every procedural step was subject to detailed examination. The juvenile accused, whose identity remained legally protected, became the focal point of the prosecution's argument. According to the agency, the evidence they had gathered pointed toward his involvement in the killing of Pradyuman Thakur. But in a court of law, conclusions must be supported not only by investigation, but by proof that meets a high standard, proof that can withstand challenge, doubt, and cross-examination. The Juvenile Justice Board had earlier ruled that the accused should be tried as a minor, a decision that shaped the trajectory of the proceedings. This meant that the case would be handled within the framework designed for juveniles, focusing not only on accountability, but also on the principles of reform and rehabilitation. It was a decision that reflected the legal system's approach to young offenders, even in cases involving serious allegations. However, it also led to continued debate, as many questioned whether such a framework was sufficient for a crime of this magnitude. As hearings progressed, the defense raised multiple objections to the CBI's conclusions. They questioned the interpretation of evidence, pointed to inconsistencies, and argued that the case against the accused was not as clear-cut as it had been presented. The earlier phase of the investigation, led by the Haryana police, remained a critical point of reference. The fact that a different individual, Ashok Kumar, had initially been arrested and accused created a layer of doubt that could not be ignored. The defense used this to argue that the investigation had been flawed from the beginning, and that the shift in narrative raised questions about the reliability of the findings. Meanwhile, Ashok Kumar's situation also moved through the legal system, with the CBI stating that there was no conclusive evidence against him. He was granted relief by the courts. His release highlighted one of the most serious concerns raised by the case, the possibility that an innocent person had been wrongly accused in the early stages of the investigation. This aspect of the case became a powerful reminder of the consequences of haste in criminal inquiries, particularly when public pressure demands quick answers. As the years went on, the case did not reach a dramatic, definitive conclusion in the way many had expected. Instead, it remained entangled in legal procedures, appeals, and ongoing examination. The complexity of the evidence, combined with the legal protections surrounding the accused, meant that the process moved slowly. For the family of Pradyuman Thakur, this prolonged timeline was a source of continued pain. The absence of closure, even years after the incident, underscored the emotional toll that such cases can take on those directly affected. Beyond the courtroom, the impact of the case was far-reaching. It triggered widespread discussions about safety measures in schools across India. Parents began to demand stricter security protocols, better supervision, and more accountability from educational institutions. Schools, in turn, faced increased scrutiny, leading many to review and strengthen their internal systems. The tragedy had exposed vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored, prompting changes aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. The case also led to broader reflections on the functioning of investigative agencies. The contrast between the initial findings of the Haryana police and the later conclusions of the Central Bureau of Investigation became a focal point for discussions about procedure, training, and accountability. It raised important questions about how investigations are conducted under pressure, how evidence is interpreted, and how errors can be avoided in high-profile cases. At a deeper level, the story revealed the challenges inherent in seeking justice. It showed that truth is not always immediately visible, that it can be obscured by assumptions, errors, and incomplete information. It demonstrated that the path to accountability is rarely straightforward, especially when a case involves multiple layers of complexity. And it highlighted the importance of persistence, of continuing to question, to examine, and to seek clarity, even when answers are not easily found. For the public, the case left a lasting impression. It was not just a story about a crime, but about the systems that respond to such crimes, their strengths, their limitations, and the ways in which they can evolve. It served as a reminder that justice is not a single moment, but a process, one that requires time, effort, and a commitment to getting it right. And at the heart of it all remained the memory of a 7-year-old boy whose life had been cut short. Pradyuman Thakur became more than just a name in a case file. He became a symbol of the need for vigilance, accountability, and compassion. His story, painful as it is, continues to resonate as a call to ensure that such tragedies are not repeated. In the end, the Ryan International School case is not defined by a single outcome, but by the journey it represents, a journey through grief, uncertainty, investigation, and the ongoing pursuit of justice. It is a story that reminds us that while answers may take time, the need to seek them never fades. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious.